Transactional funding. Transactional funding is funding for one day on a back-to-back closing. Back-to-back closings are executed in order for a real estate investor to earn their fee for their time and effort. This is similar to any wholesale transaction where the wholesaler would buy low and sell high and keep the difference as their profit. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to go through an example. A typical example these days is for a HUD transaction or an REO transaction. So let's go with a HUD transaction and let's take you through this. So for example, let's say Mr. John bought a house for $500,000 with 100% financing and an ARM mortgage, adjustable rate mortgage. And over time, the interest rates increase and the rate adjusts higher. And so his payments would increase, John's payments. And at the same time, let's say the housing market takes a dive, or his house is not worth as much as when he bought it. So let's say it's now worth $400,000. So now he owes more. Well, the house is worth less than what he owes. At the same time, Mr. John loses his job. So now he's trying to sell, but he can't sell. Why can't he sell? Because he owes $500,000. His house is worth $400,000. In order for him to sell, he would have to come up with $100,000 out of his pocket in order to sell and break even. So what's he to do? He is actually stuck. He is behind on payments, facing foreclosure, and he needs help. So now, as the wholesaler, you, for example, you are called the B investor. And then the seller, which is now HUD takes back John's house. That would be HUD would be known as the A seller, and you, as the investor or as the wholesaler, you would be known as the B investor. So you would go to HUD and farm these properties, and you would negotiate with HUD in order to acquire this property at a lower price. Let's say you were successful, and you negotiated and are approved for $300,000 to buy this house from HUD. At the same time, you will look for a C buyer. And Mr. B finds a retail cash buyer, Mr. C, to buy the property for $375,000. So remember, the market value is $400,000. So at this point, you are ready to arrange for a back-to-back closing on the same day. So on the first transaction, it's called the A-B closing, and that's for $300,000, where Mr. B, the wholesaler, will buy from HUD, which is A, for $300,000 for that same property. For that closing, where does Mr. B get the money to close the AB? You guessed it, it's $300,000 from a transactional funder. And that's how you close the first transaction. Now for the second transaction, the BC closing, where the wholesaler B sells to Mr. C, which is the end buyer, they close for $375,000. And after they close, Mr. B, the investor, keeps roughly $75,000 less closing costs. So now in the end, everybody wins. The HUD wins because they get rid of a bad asset, a non-performing asset. C wins because they bought a house for $375,000 with built-in equity of $25,000, and Mr. B wins because he gets to keep $75,000 less closing costs. So that's it as far as a typical example of how transactional funding funds wholesalers. So now let's get into the process of transactional funding, of the funding process. So this is within the industry. These are industry notes. So funding process: within 2 weeks of the closing, B contacts a transactional funder. B investor and closing agent then submit required paperwork, and the C buyer wires first, and then funder wires the money to the disbursing agent on the day of closing. B investor also applies for transactional funding prior to submitting the paperwork, of course. Next, the funding process. I will explain to you in order. The B investor signs the transactional funding paperwork. A, B, and BC close. Closing agent disperses all escrowed funds for both transactions. And then closing agent has to be the same agent for both transactions. That is a requirement from all transactional funders. What are the qualifications? No LTV, no credit check, no appraisal, no income verification, easy approval, fast setup, proof of funds letters provided, 100% financing at closing, so no money out of pocket, and it's the least expensive way to double close. So all this means nothing. You really, it's the easiest loan you can get. It's based on the transaction, not your credit or not anyone else's credit worthiness. So what's the catch? 1 day rate, typically 2 to 5%. That's not our rate, that is the industry rate. Funding application to identify the A, B, C parties, property and closing agent. Processing fee of anywhere from $4.95 to $6.95. Purchase and sale agreement between A to B. Short sale approval letter from A's lender if applicable. Sale agreement between the B to C. Proof of funds from C cash buyer. Title company information, licensure commitment. C's funds must be wired into closing agent versus bank or certified checks. Closing agent must provide proof of cleared and wired funds. So the conclusion as far as transactional funding industry is concerned is that funding is based on the transaction, not the investor or the property. That's why it's so easy to apply and so easy to get approved, and it's really fast to get funded. Allows for back-to-back transactions to close without issues due to separate funds. Simple and has